The land sold for $190 on a Thursday morning in October of 1971, and every man at the Harlan County Deed Office who heard the price said the same thing before the day was out. He paid what? Elias Cord was 61 years old and had farmed the same 47 acres in southeastern Kentucky his entire life. He drove a 1958 Ford F-100, the color of old rust, wore the same canvas work jacket from September through April, and had not said an unnecessary word to anyone in recent memory. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had learned early that talking cost, time and time, cost everything on a small farm. People in Caneyville respected him in the distant way communities respect men who cause no trouble and ask for nothing. They did not think much about him otherwise. The bottom land he bought that Thursday sat where Clifton Creek bent south before joining the Green River, 42 acres of low ground that flooded 3, sometimes 4 times a year. The soil was gray-brown clay that turned to the consistency of wet cement when the water rose and cracked into hard, pale plates when it finally dried. Nothing held there. The Pemberton family had owned it for 11 years and grown nothing on it except frustration and property tax bills. Before the Pembertons, it had belonged to a feed mill operator named Grady Shoemate, who tried to run cattle on the higher edges and lost 2 cows to sinkholes in the spring of 1955. The deed had passed through 4 owners in 30 years, and every one of them had eventually walked away. When the Pembertons listed it, they asked $800. They came down to $550 after 2 months. After 6 months, they would have taken $300 and been relieved. When Elias Cord walked into their kitchen in late September and laid an offer of $190 on the table, Merle Pemberton looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up his pen and signed it before the old man could leave. His wife asked him afterward if he felt bad taking money from someone making such a clear mistake. Merle said he felt fine. Word reached the co-op by Friday. By the following Tuesday, it had made the rounds of every farm within 8 miles. The version most people heard was that Elias Cord had lost his mind or his eyesight, or possibly both, because only a blind man or a fool would spend good money on the Pemberton bottom. Darrell Fitch, who ran 400 acres of corn and soybeans north of town and had looked at the Pemberton parcel himself before walking away laughing, said it loud enough in the feed store for everyone to hear. That old man just paid $190 to own a mud hole. Might as well have set fire to the bills and stayed warm. People laughed, not cruelly, exactly, more the way people laugh when someone does something so confusing the only response is sound. Elias Cord heard none of this directly. He was already walking his new land. He walked it the same afternoon the deed transferred. He parked the F-100 on the gravel county road where it edged the property and went in on foot, moving slowly because the ground demanded it. The soil pulled at his boots with every step, the kind of wet clay suck that made a man conscious of his own weight. The creek had flooded 3 weeks earlier, a modest rise that had still managed to push 2 feet of water across the low ground before pulling back. The evidence was everywhere: dried water lines on the fence posts, debris caught in the scrub willow branches, and coating everything, absolutely everything. A thin dark film that cracked now in the October dry like the surface of old chocolate. He crouched down on the north end of the parcel where the ground was lowest and scraped at the surface with his thumbnail. The dark film came away easily, and underneath was more of the same dark, almost black, and rich smelling in the way that good river-bottom soil smells, like something alive and patient. He pressed it between his fingers and felt no grit. Pure silt, the finest particles the creek carried, dropped here where the water slowed and spread. He stood and walked the whole perimeter. An hour and a half in the October afternoon, boots soaked through, saying nothing. He noted where the water pooled longest by the color and density of the sediment deposits. He noted the two shallow channels the creek had carved for itself across the southeast corner, running roughly toward the lower pasture edge. He looked at the bend in Clifton Creek from 3 different angles and watched the way the current moved against the far bank. Then he drove home. That evening he sat at his kitchen table with a piece of graph paper and drew what he had seen. He did not show the drawing to anyone. The first flood of his ownership came in February of 1972, a hard February rise that pushed the creek 6 feet above normal and sent water sheeting across the bottom for 11 days. When it receded, Elias drove down and walked the land again. The silt layer was thicker now, a 1/4 inch across most of the parcel. He scraped it up in several places, pressed it, smelled it, rolled it between his palms. He made small marks on his graph paper when he got home. He was measuring something. What he was measuring, he did not tell anyone. 3 floods came in 1973, 2 in 1974. Each time, Elias walked the land after the water pulled back. He made his marks. He watched the 2 channels in the southeast corner. After the April flood of 1974, he noticed something. The channels were deeper, not dramatically 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4, but deeper. The water had been carving at them, slowly widening the gradient toward the lower ground. He stood at the head of those channels for a long time. His neighbor to the north, a younger farmer named Roy Hatch, who had taken over his father's place 2 years earlier and immediately borrowed $60,000 to buy a new Massey Ferguson, 1,100 and a set of drainage tile equipment, stopped his truck on the county road one afternoon and called over to Elias across the fence line. "You ever going to do something with that ground?" Elias looked up from where he was crouched at the channel edge. "Doing something with it now," he said. Roy Hatch waited for more. Nothing came. He drove on. In the winter of 1975, a county extension agent named Phil Garrettson drove out to talk to several farmers in the area about federal cost-share programs for drainage tile installation. Harlan County had access to $300,000 in USDA funds that year, and Garrettson was trying to get farmers to apply before the deadline. He stopped at Elias Cord's farm as a courtesy, though he privately considered the visit a waste of an afternoon. He sat at Elias's kitchen table with his program brochures and his clipboard and explained the program. The government would pay 60% of the cost of installing subsurface drainage tile on eligible land. Wet bottom land was exactly the kind of acreage the program was designed for. Elias's 42 acres down by the creek could potentially qualify for substantial assistance. Garrettson laid out his estimate. Full tile drainage installation on that parcel, given the soil type and the topography, would run somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 total. With the cost share, Elias's portion might be as low as $1,600. Elias listened to all of it without interrupting. When Garrettson finished, he poured them both coffee and sat down. "What does the tile do exactly?" he asked. Garrettson explained. "Perforated pipe buried below the plow layer, running toward a drainage outlet, intercepts subsurface water and carries it off the field. Lowers the water table, allows the root zone to dry sufficiently for cultivation. Standard practice on wet bottom land throughout the region." Elias nodded slowly. "Does it bring in soil?" he asked. Garrettson looked at him. "Does it bring in soil?" Elias said again. "The way a flood does. Does tile drainage deposit material?" "No," Garrettson said. "That's not no. Drainage tile removes water. It doesn't affect sediment deposition." Elias nodded again and looked at his coffee. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. Garrettson drove back to town and mentioned to a few people that old Cord down on the creek road had turned down the cost-share program, which he described as leaving money on the table. This made its way back to Darrell Fitch, who shook his head slowly and said that a man willing to pay $190 for a mud hole was probably the type of man who would also refuse free money from the government, and both facts made exactly the same amount of sense. The laughter in the feed store was the same as before, easy and brief and already moving on to something else. Elias Cord went back to walking his land. In 1977, the creek flooded 4 times. The April rise was the largest Elias had seen since he bought the parcel. The gauge on the county bridge read 9 feet above normal, and the water stayed on his bottom ground for 16 days. When it finally pulled back, he drove down at first light and walked the perimeter before the ground had dried enough to support his weight, picking his way carefully along the higher edges. The silt deposit from that single flood was extraordinary. He measured it along a transect he had established with fence stakes in 1972, a line of markers running north to south across the lowest quarter of the parcel. The average new deposit along that transect was just over half an inch. Some sections showed nearly 3/4. He crouched at the midpoint marker and scooped up a handful of the material and held it in both palms. The color was almost black. The texture was dense and fine and held its shape when he squeezed it. He brought it close and breathed in through his nose. The smell was deep and organic and faintly sweet, the smell of material that had traveled a long distance and carried everything it had gathered along the way. He stood up and looked south toward the creek bend. The 2 channels in the southeast corner were now unmistakable. They had been slight depressions in 1971. By 1977, they were 3 feet deep and 6 feet across at the opening, running toward the lower pasture edge where the ground dropped away toward Roy Hatch's fence line. After this flood, for the first time, Elias stood at the head of those channels and watched water actively moving through them as the flood receded, not the sheet flow of the flood itself, but drainage. The low ground was beginning to drain itself. He made a long entry in his graph paper record that evening. He had been keeping the record for 6 years. It covered 14 pages now, with sketched cross-sections and elevation notes and sediment measurements and observations about the creek's behavior at the bend during each flood event. He had shared none of it with anyone. In 1979, the 2 channels connected to a third, smaller one that had formed along the east property line. Elias saw it for the first time in June, after a moderate rise. He stood at the junction point where the 3 channels met and watched the last of the floodwater moving through with genuine purpose, finding the gradient, cutting the path wider as it went. He drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he drove to the Southern States Cooperative in town and priced winter wheat seed. He did not buy any yet, but he priced it. Roy Hatch saw Elias's truck in the co-op lot and stopped in to pick up a part for his tractor. He found the old man at the seed counter with a catalog open and almost said something. But there was something in the way Elias was looking at the catalog, not casually browsing but studying, the way a man studies something he has been thinking about for a long time, that made Roy Hatch simply nod and walk on to the parts counter. He thought about it later that night but could not quite name what he had seen in the old man's face. Something that was not excitement exactly, more like confirmation. Through 1,980 and 1,981, Elias watched the channels continue their work. The lowest quarter of his parcel, the section that had held standing water for weeks after every flood when he first bought the land, now drained within 4 days of a moderate rise and within 8 days of a heavy one. The black silt that had been depositing there for 10 years was exposed to air and sunlight. Volunteer plants, not crops, but plants, the opportunistic species that follow receding water, began establishing on those sections in the summers. Elias let them grow. He watched their root systems when he pulled them up in the fall, measuring how deep they penetrated, how the soil responded. The roots went deep. The soil did not compact around them. It held structure. In the spring of 1982, Elias Cord planted his bottom ground for the first time. He did not plant the whole parcel. He planted the 14 acres that had been draining consistently the southeast quadrant that the channels ran through, the lowest ground that had been receiving the heaviest silt deposits for 11 years. He planted it in corn, a hybrid variety from DeKalb that the co-op had been pushing that season, and he planted it 3 days after a late April flood had receded and the ground had dried to workable condition. He used his old Farmall M, a 1952 model that he had bought second-hand in 1961 for $800 and maintained himself for the 21 years since. The co-op service manager, a younger man named Tommy Creech, had once offered to help him trade it toward a newer model and been turned down so simply and finally that he had never brought it up again. The Farmall ran. That was the end of the discussion. He planted 14 acres in 2 days, working alone, and when he finished he drove home and ate supper and did not mention it to anyone. The corn went in at 32,000 seeds per acre, standard practice for the era, the same population Darrell Fitch and Roy Hatch and every other corn farmer in the county was planting. The conditions afterward were unremarkable: a dry May, a wet June, adequate July heat. Nothing that separated Elias's ground from anyone else's that season in terms of weather inputs. But the soil was not like anyone else's soil. By the first week of July, Roy Hatch was driving past on the county road and slowed his truck without thinking about why. He stopped and sat with the engine running, looking through the fence at the corn growing on the cord bottom ground. It was tall. Not slightly tall, dramatically, confusingly tall. He looked at his own corn 3 miles north and then back at this corn and felt something uncomfortable settle into his chest. He did not stop and say anything. He drove on. By August, the stalks were standing at 12 feet in the best sections of the bottom ground. The ears were heavy and set double on many plants, 2 ears per stalk, a thing that happens when soil fertility and moisture balance combine in a way that happens rarely and cannot be manufactured. Elias walked his rows in the evenings, looking at the ears, pressing on the husks, not celebrating exactly, but with the steady, quiet satisfaction of a man who calculated something across 11 years and is watching the calculation prove out. Darrell Fitch came past on the county road in the second week of August and stopped his truck. He sat there for several minutes. Then he got out and walked to the fence line and stood there in his good boots and his bill cap with the Pioneer Seed logo on the front, and he looked at the corn on the cord bottom for a long time without moving. Then he drove to the co-op and told Tommy Creech what he had seen, and Tommy Creech told 3 other people before closing time, and by the following week the story had begun to move through the community, the same way the silt had moved through Elias Cord's bottom ground, slowly, surely, settling where it found the right gradient. Elias harvested that 14 acres in October of 1982. His yield was 211 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 106. He said nothing about this. He delivered his corn to the elevator in town, collected his ticket, folded it into his shirt pocket, and drove home. But the elevator manager, a careful record-keeping man named Burl Stamper, looked at the delivery weight against the acreage on Elias's ticket and looked at it again, and then walked out to his truck before the old man could leave the lot. "Is this right?" Burl said, holding the ticket. "This acreage?" "It's right," Elias said. Burl Stamper looked at the ticket again. He had been managing the elevator for 19 years. He had seen good yields and bad yields, and every kind in between. He had never written a ticket that worked out to 211 bushels on ground in Harlan County. He folded the ticket slowly and handed it back through the truck window. "That's something," he said. Elias nodded and put it in his pocket. "Yes, it is," he said, and drove out of the lot. By spring of 1983, everyone knew. The number had come out of the elevator. These things always come out of the elevator eventually, and it had traveled the same route as every piece of farming news in Harlan County, through the co-op and the feed store and the diner on Main Street and the church parking lots on Sunday morning, 211 bushels. On the Pemberton bottom. On ground that Merle Pemberton couldn't grow a fence post in. On ground that Elias Cord had bought for $190 and done nothing to for 11 years except walk around on it. Roy Hatch came to see him in March. He drove into the yard and knocked on the door, and when Elias opened it, Roy took off his hat and stood there on the porch with it in his hands. "I need to understand what you did," Roy said. Elias looked at him for a moment and then opened the door wider. They sat at the kitchen table, and Elias brought out the graph paper record, all 14 pages of it. He laid it open at the beginning and talked Roy Hatch through it from the October afternoon in 1971 when he had first walked the land and scraped at that dark crust with his thumbnail, through the flood records and the sediment measurements and the channel formation observations, through the 11 years of watching and waiting and measuring. Roy Hatch was 34 years old and had borrowed $60,000 to install drainage tile and buy a new tractor. And he sat at that table and looked at 14 pages of graph paper and did not speak for a long time. "You watched it drain itself," he finally said. Elias nodded. "And the whole time it was draining itself, it was also building the soil." "That's right." Roy looked at the sediment measurements. The numbers climbed across the years, accumulation on accumulation, flood layer on flood layer. "So the flooding wasn't the problem," Roy said slowly. "The flooding was the point." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he had known since the afternoon he first crouched on that ground and pressed the silt between his fingers. "The creek had been building that soil for 1,000 years, he said. Every flood, it brought a little more and left it there. The only question was whether the water would eventually find a way out. And the land that floods always does. Water finds lower ground, always has." He paused. "I just needed to know if that bend in the creek would give it enough time to build before it drained, and I needed to know how long the draining would take, so I watched." Roy Hatch put his hat back on and stood up. "How did you know," he said, "before you bought it? How did you know it would work?" Elias thought about this honestly. "I didn't know," he said. "I believed. There's a difference. Knowing means you don't have to wait. Believing means you do." Roy Hatch shook his hand at the door and drove home and thought about that sentence for 3 days before he understood it completely. Darrell Fitch did not come himself. He sent his son, a 23-year-old named Curtis, who had just started farming alongside his father and had the good sense to be curious about things his father only understood as insults to his certainty. Curtis Fitch sat where Roy Hatch had sat and looked at the same 14 pages and asked different questions, more technical ones, about the specific sediment composition, about the channel gradient, about why the soil held structure instead of compacting after repeated saturation. Elias answered every question. He had been observing these things for 11 years and found that he had answers he had not known he possessed until someone asked. Curtis drove home and told his father what he had learned. Darrell Fitch listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and then walked out to his equipment shed and stood there for a while among his machinery. In 1983, Elias planted 22 acres of the bottom ground, the original 14 plus 8 more acres, in the north section that had been draining sufficiently by the previous fall. He planted both corn and soybeans, rotating from the prior year. The soybean ground, on the deepest silt deposits in the northwest quarter, yielded 61 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 38. Phil Garrettson, the extension agent who had sat at Elias's table in 1975 and explained the cost-share drainage program, read the yield data that came out of the elevator that fall and drove out to the county road to look at the Cord bottom from the fence line. He stood there in November with the fields already harvested and looked at the dark, bare soil. Even turned by the disk, even exposed to October rain and November chill, the surface had a color unlike the surrounding farmland, deeper, darker, with none of the pale clay that showed through in the neighboring fields after tillage. He drove back to his office and wrote a report for the State Extension Service. In the report, he described what Elias Cord had done, or more precisely, what Elias Cord had chosen not to do and the results it had produced. He used careful language. He cited the yield data. He noted the soil type and the deposition mechanism, and the natural drainage that had formed through creek channel dynamics. He did not use the word patient in the report because it was not a scientific term, but he thought it the entire time he was writing. By 1985, the Cord bottom was spoken about in a specific way in Harlan County. People said it the way they said the name of a particular horse or a particular piece of equipment that had distinguished itself beyond ordinary expectation. They said the Cord bottom land like it meant something. County agents brought farmers to stand at the fence line and look at it the way they might bring students to look at something instructive. The soil, even to an untrained eye, looked different from what surrounded it, darker, looser, with a friability and depth that the region's typical clay loams did not show. Elias farmed all 42 acres by 1986. The channels in the southeast had widened enough that the entire parcel drained to workable condition within 5 to 7 days of any flood event. He ran corn and soybeans in rotation, kept meticulous yield records, and maintained the Farmall M with the same regular attention he had given it for 25 years. He did not buy new equipment. He did not need to. The ground did most of the work, ground that good does. Merle Pemberton heard all of this and said very little publicly. Privately, he told his wife one evening that selling that land for $190 was the thing he would think about on his deathbed, and not in the way a man wants to think about things on his deathbed. His wife reminded him that he had been relieved at the time, and she had witnessed his relief with her own eyes, and Merle said yes, and that was the other part that would bother him. Darrell Fitch never said anything directly to Elias Cord about the bottom land. But in 1987 he let a low, wet corner of his own property, a 4-acre section that flooded each spring, and that he had been fighting with drainage tile for a decade, go unworked for the season. He watched it. He made some notes. The notes were rougher and less systematic than 14 pages of graph paper, but they existed. His son Curtis saw the notes on his father's desk one evening and said nothing about them. But he understood what they meant, and he thought about the afternoon he had sat at Elias Cord's kitchen table and looked at the real thing. Roy Hatch planted a cover crop on his own, low ground that winter instead of leaving it bare, which was what he had always done. And he thought about soil structure and deposition and what it meant to work with a piece of land rather than against it. He did not have a flooded bottom or a creek bringing him silt. But the idea had shifted something in how he thought about his ground, and he felt it changed the way he made decisions the following spring and the spring after that. In 1988, the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture sent a soil scientist named Dr. Marion Hess to Harlan County to look at the Cord bottom as part of a study on natural sediment accumulation and its agronomic implications in floodplain soils. She spent 2 days there, taking core samples at intervals across the parcel, measuring organic matter content, running infiltration tests, profiling the soil horizon by horizon. Her samples showed an organic matter content of 5.8% in the top 8 inches of the oldest deposition areas, the sections of deepest silt in the northwest and southeast quadrants. The surrounding county farmland averaged 1.9%. The infiltration rate on the bottom was nearly 4 times the county average. The soil horizon showed 18 inches of dark, biologically active material above the clay subsoil layer compared to 8 to 10 inches in the surrounding fields. She stood at the edge of the parcel on the second afternoon with her clipboard and looked out over the dark ground and said to Elias, who was standing beside her, that she had not seen a naturally occurring soil profile like this anywhere in Kentucky outside of the old Ohio River bottomlands. Elias nodded slowly. "The creek built it," he said. "Over how long?" she asked. He considered. 1,000 years before I got here," he said, "and 17 years since." She wrote down what he said and included it in her paper, which was published the following year in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. The paper described the Cord Bottom land in Harlan County, Kentucky, as a case study in the agronomic potential of managed patience in floodplain soil development. That phrase, managed patience, appeared in the abstract and was reprinted by 2 extension services and 1 farm magazine. Elias did not read the paper. Tommy Creech at the co-op told him about it, described what it said, and Elias listened and then bought the seed he had come in for and drove home. He was 78 years old. He had been farming for 57 years. He had owned the bottom land for 17 years and farmed it actively for 6. His yields the previous season had been 219 bushels per acre on the corn ground, 8 bushels better than his first harvest on the parcel, because the soil was still improving. It would continue to improve. The creek was still flooding, the channels were still working, the silt was still settling. He had paid $190 for a process that had already been running for 1,000 years, and that would continue running long after he was gone. That was the thing nobody had understood when they laughed, and the thing he had never explained, because it was not the kind of thing a man explains. It is the kind of thing a man either sees or does not see. Either the dark crust on wet clay means something to you when you press it between your fingers, or it does not. He maintained the farm all in. He walked his land every week, spring through fall. He made his notes. He watched the channels. The co-op still sold new equipment. The extension service still ran cost-share programs. Farmers still borrowed money for tile drainage and bigger tractors and yield monitor systems and all the technology that the decade kept producing. Elias Cord farmed his 42 acres of dark, deep, river-built soil with a 1,952 tractor and a canvas work jacket and 14 pages of graph paper that had told him, before any soil scientist confirmed it, everything he needed to know. Nothing about him changed. The world had simply caught up to him for an afternoon and then moved on, and he had stayed exactly where he was, doing what the land required. Some knowledge is not modern or old. It is just true, and the truest things do not need to be loud. They only need enough time.